Have you ever read a book that you were genuinely enjoying, followed the story without any trouble, and then closed it? Welcome to Book Labyrinth, where we unravel the stories behind the pages. At the end of a chapter, everything seemed clear while you were reading. But the next day, when you try to think back on it, you suddenly realize you can barely remember what happened. Maybe you even forget the name of a character or two. Of course, some people naturally have incredible recall, so this probably isn't much of an issue for them. But I hear people talk about this all the time. And honestly, I think most of us experience it at least occasionally. So why does this happen? Why is it that sometimes we can remember an idea from a book for years, while other times we can finish an entire chapter and barely remember it a day later? A lot of the conversation around this problem today focuses on distraction. And that's understandable. We live in a world where our attention is constantly being pulled in different directions. We're surrounded by phones, notifications, social media, emails, and endless streams of information. And yes, all of that can absolutely interfere with our ability to concentrate. But I think there's another part of the problem that we don't talk about quite as much. Because sometimes we forget what we've read even when we're genuinely trying to pay attention. The problem may actually begin with the way we've learned to read. Think about how much reading you do throughout an ordinary day. You might read a text message, glance through an email, scroll through comments, check an article, look at a headline, or jump between different websites. Most of this material is short, simple, and designed to be processed quickly. You don't necessarily need to stop and reflect on every sentence. Researchers sometimes describe this kind of reading as hyper-reading. The objective isn't necessarily to understand something deeply. It's usually about finding useful information as efficiently as possible. You scan for important words. You skip around. You jump between sections. You look for the part you're interested in and move on. And for this kind of material, that approach works perfectly well. But reading a novel is completely different. When you're reading fiction, you have to stay immersed in a much longer chain of events. Details from one chapter might become important several chapters later. You have to remember relationships, motivations, settings, conflicts, and subtle changes in the characters. Your brain has to maintain a much more complicated web of connections. And then there's another kind of reading altogether. Analytical reading. This is what you might do when reading philosophy, physics, economics, or another intellectually demanding subject. You can't really rush through this kind of material. You may need to stop, reread a paragraph, think through an argument, and sometimes go back several pages just to make sure you understand what the author is saying. These different approaches to reading can be thought of as different modes, but immersive and analytical reading fall under a broader category known as deep reading. Marianne Wolf, a cognitive neuroscientist who has spent much of her career studying reading and literacy, has been one of the prominent voices warning about what digital environments may be doing to our ability to read deeply. She describes deep reading as involving a whole range of sophisticated mental processes, making inferences, reasoning deductively, recognizing analogies, critically analyzing information, reflecting on ideas, and developing insight. That sounds complicated, but the basic idea is actually pretty simple. Deep reading isn't just about seeing words and understanding what they literally say. It's about giving your mind enough time to interact with those words. You slow down. You think about what the author is actually saying. You question it. You compare it with things you already know. You connect it to your own experiences. You notice relationships between different ideas. In other words, you're doing actual mental work. And that's one of the reasons deep reading tends to be better for memory. Memory isn't simply a matter of seeing information and understanding it once. What matters is what your brain does with that information afterward. If you're analyzing an idea, connecting it to something you already know, questioning it, or trying to explain it to yourself, you're creating more mental connections. But if something is extremely easy to read, you can sometimes move through it without doing much mental work at all. And this creates an interesting problem. You might finish a passage and think, yeah, I understood that. But understanding something in the moment doesn't necessarily mean you'll remember it later. Comprehension and memory aren't exactly the same thing. Sometimes a passage can feel easy precisely because you're not engaging with it very deeply. And this becomes especially important because hyper-reading has become the default way many of us interact with text. We've spent so much time reading short pieces of information online that our brains have become accustomed to moving quickly. So when we finally sit down with a Bartram page book, we can't necessarily just tell ourselves, okay, now read deeply. Even if the phone is in another room, even if the television is turned off, even if we're genuinely trying to concentrate. Our reading habits don't necessarily change just because the environment changes. There are, of course, plenty of suggestions for improving this. You can read with a specific purpose. You can keep your phone away. You can develop a regular reading habit. You can slow down. You can take notes. You can keep a reading journal. You can stop after a chapter and summarize what you just read. I've suggested many of these things myself, and I still think they can be useful. But I don't think any particular reading trick is going to solve the problem on its own. What matters more is creating an environment where concentration and active thinking can actually happen. Recently, instead of trying to invent another complicated reading system or force myself into some perfect routine, I've been doing something much simpler. I've been going back to the way I used to read. For me, that often means going to a library. I spent a lot of time in libraries during my undergraduate and graduate years. I even worked in one throughout those years, and my first real job after university was also at a library. There's something about being in a library that makes it easier for me to settle into a book. In fact, this channel is named after a place in my old library where I used to go whenever I wanted to be alone and completely disappear into a book. Obviously, not everyone has easy access to a library, and not everyone enjoys reading in one. So you could create your own version of that environment at home. Find a quiet corner. Keep it away from the television. Put your phone somewhere else. Close the laptop. Remove as many digital distractions as possible. The goal isn't to create some elaborate aesthetic reading setup. It's simply to give your brain a place where it knows that the purpose is to read and think. There's another thing that I think is worth considering: how long you actually read for. A lot of modern reading happens in tiny fragments. You read for 5 minutes, get interrupted, come back later, read for another 10 minutes, check something on your phone, and then try to pick the book up again. The problem is that deep concentration doesn't always work that way. It's difficult to enter a real state of flow when you're constantly stopping and starting. If you can give yourself a longer, uninterrupted period of time, say an hour each day, you gradually give your mind an opportunity to become comfortable with that slower rhythm. Over time, reading deeply can start to feel less like something you're forcing yourself to do and more like a natural mental state. So the next time you finish a chapter and realize you can't remember much of it, don't immediately assume that you have a bad memory. Instead, ask yourself a different question. How was I reading? Was I actually immersed in the book? Or was I approaching it with the same mental habits I use when I'm scrolling through the internet? Sometimes simply noticing the difference is enough to start changing the way you read. Because if you want to remember a book long after you've put it down, it's not enough to simply move your eyes across the page. You have to give your mind enough time to slow down, make connections, question ideas, and actually engage with what you're reading. And that's really what deep reading is about. If there's a book you'd like me to review, just drop the title in the comments. Need the ebook? Message me on Telegram. And if this video was useful to you, a small coffee donation goes a long way in keeping this channel going.